for many reasons, but just because of the fact that he brings so much life and energy because he loves the actual subject. And those of us who have taken heat and mass transfer know how freaking hard it is. So just having that extra life and energy being brought into us during a really, really tough junior year. He has done so much stuff in and out of the academic system. And it is my pleasure to present one of the most exciting professors on Stony Brook campus, Dr. Dimitris Assanis.
Thank you so much, Alex. Do you mind enabling screen share?
Hey, Hiram, can you enable screen share for Dimitris Assanis?
Hey, yeah, let me just try to figure that out really quickly.
Sure. Well, I'd like to first thank you for inviting me to give a Tau talk. Thank you to both the organizations that put it on. It's nice to see that you're engaging your fellow engineers, and hopefully through these little seminars, these mini seminars, you're able to get some applications of engineering and a little excitement in your life, right? Because a lot of the book work can be mundane. So when you finish your degree program, then you can work on some exciting stuff. And maybe my topic isn't necessarily your cup of tea, right? But maybe you just came here today to learn about it. Or maybe it is, right? And I might excite you a little bit and show you that internal combustion engines today need bright young engineers such as yourselves to join the ranks. And I hope to make the case to you to know why this topic is so important.
Hey, Professor, can you try screen sharing? I think I should have enabled it for you. Okay, there we go.
Can you see that?
Yeah, it looks perfect, Professor.
Okay, I just gotta change my presenter. Okay, does that work?
That's beautiful, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone. My name's Dimitris Assanis. I'm an assistant professor in mechanical engineering. I'm also affiliated with the Institute for Advanced Computational Science and the faculty advisor for Pi Tau Sigma. I'm also an appointed member of the Transportation Advisory Panel for the New York State Clean Action Council. Today, it's my honor to try to inspire you a little bit about internal combustion engines, and I've tried to make a little pun here on the title to say, is the end of an ice age, right? Are we at the end of the internal combustion engine age? You hear all about electric vehicles around you. We hear about how CO2 is getting out of hand. A lot of it is man-made. And internal combustion engines are to blame. And one thing, before we get started with this presentation is I want you to know that as a young engineer myself, right, I committed to a career that, I decided that I wanted to research and help this cause for the next 20, 30, 40 years, right? And if I didn't see a future for this, then, well, I would have made a really, really bad mistake, right? And I'd be probably out of a job in 5 years. So with that in mind, I don't want you to think that I'm biased on this topic, but this topic is one that excites me. I've grown up around engines. I've tinkered on engines. I've changed engines on cars. I've rebuilt engines. I've oogled at brand new engines such as the Bugatti W12 when it came out, which is two V6s next to each other. And I continue to be inspired by not just internal combustion engines, but general advancements in ground transportation and passenger transportation, specifically connectivity and automation, technologies that are penetrating through new vehicles now. I just find that so fascinating that, you know, the driver, the most inefficient part of the system, right, regardless of powertrain under the hood, has the ability to now be quote unquote corrected. And we know this for a fact, right? Because if you've driven with your grandma, for example, you know that she gets way better fuel economy than when you're late for writing your heat transfer exam. And same thing, you know, for me, right? When I'm driving to class or you know, trying to get around town to get to what I'm doing, maybe I'm not the most fuel efficient individual, but it's neat that connectivity and automation can give us this ability to smooth out driver profiles and improve efficiency of vehicles. I also continue to be inspired by all the new technologies, both fuels and powertrains, including full electrification of vehicles. You know, I used to be a big remote control fan growing up, and oddly enough, as big of an internal combustion engine guy that I am, I never owned one gas-powered remote control vehicle. And back in the day, I was just fascinated with battery packs and swaps and the fact that you could have instant torque. You know, it was all great up until, of course, the battery ran out about 15 minutes after I started really playing with the car. And okay, then you maybe do a battery change or you just go on to the next thing. But anyways, let's get along with the topic today. But just to give you a little idea, I'm very enthused with the automotive industry in general, where it's heading, and I hope to provide you a little piece here of internal combustion engine. What is an internal combustion engine? So it's a mechanical device. You can see the inner pinnings of one in the bottom right hand corner. There's a piston and a crank slider arrangement. In the top right there, you can see a V8, a Hemi, one that goes in a Hellcat vehicle, the 6.2 crate engine. Lots, oodles and noodles of torque that can be provided out of that. I don't want to get into the underpinnings of what an internal combustion engine is. If you want to do that, you know, small plug here to take my class in the fall of this year, 2021, actually, not 2022. We can make that quick adjustment for everyone. And you'll learn all about it. What you should know is that a lot of vehicles are powered today by internal combustion engines, okay? And they have rather a dirty outlook, okay? We know that there's emissions that come out the tailpipe. We know that they're not the cleanest. So there's a big push to essentially ban internal combustion engines around the world. But before we banish it, just like we did with the dinosaurs, let's take a little travel down memory lane and look at kind of a brief historical perspective of the internal combustion engine. First engines, maybe around 1860 or so. In the 60s, so Lenoir developed an engine that burned coal, gas, air mixtures. So, I mean, couldn't be any dirtier than that. But, you know, it was one of the first running engines on there. It displaced horse-drawn carriages. Thankfully, only about 5,000 of these engines were built. And to give you an idea, these were about 6 horsepower and had an efficiency of like a thermal efficiency of 5%. Contextually speaking, that 5% thermal efficiency number has gone an order of magnitude higher, and we're sitting at probably around 50% efficiency in the internal combustion engine itself. A little after the 60s, in 1876, Auto builds the first 4-stroke engine. That's the animation you saw on this previous slide. It's the type of engine that is in most vehicles today, if not all. So big revelation change there. And then in 1893, we had Rudolf Diesel receive his patent on the compression ignition internal combustion engine, which was a different variant of the auto of Sir Otto's. So the Otto engine becomes to be essentially what burns gasoline today and is spark ignited. And Rudolf Diesel's engine becomes essentially what we know today as a compression ignition or the diesel engine. But all these were very low volume productions. It wasn't until about 40 years ago, roughly 30 years ago, that we had the production of the Model T when that became. And really this now commoditized the vehicle, okay? And this is arguably when vehicles started becoming a problem, because if you have onesies, twosies, you just have 5,000 here and 5,000 there, that's not so much, right? But once you start making production lines and affording this to many, now we have to start worrying about things. As you can see, the fuel economy was actually not terrible for back in the day, 13 to 20 miles per gallon. Some of us have driven in our lifetimes SUVs that get worse fuel economy than that number. And they were cheap, right? They were very cheap. 1939, we had the first volume production car to be fitted with a diesel engine. Okay, so now we have the Model T that has a spark ignition engine. And then about 30 years later, we have the first diesel vehicle, the Mercedes 260D, which you may have seen in junkyards, or auto enthusiasts collect them as well. These things are bloody tanks, and they will burn everything that you basically put under them, including fryer oil, if you know any that have done conversions to them. We keep selling vehicles, everyone's life keeps improving until the 70s and 1970, when we realized we really have a problem here. And we have smog that is so thick in some of our big cities that we have to start addressing this pollution. Clean Air Act happens in the 70s. And the response to the Clean Air Act in 1975 is we start retrofitting after treatment devices. So after the engine, a series of devices that will essentially help clean up the pollutants that are being emitted. The three-way catalyst, it is a after treatment device that is pretty much in all of our vehicles that drove today, is responsible for cleaning up over 99 or 99.9% of the pollutants that an engine puts out. Okay, and it's really been a blessing to have married with the internal combustion engine, has allowed for it to continue operating for so long. Somewhere around the 80s or 90s, GM builds the first electric vehicle, by the way. Try to market it, doesn't really go anywhere. In the 2000s, and they say this is the future of automobiles, right? And here we are in 2020, maybe 30, 40 years later, and the future of the automobiles is just starting to, we see the tip of the iceberg here. In the 2000s, a very important step happens to the internal combustion engine, and we see the first Toyota Prius on the market, and it now has shown us that we can hybridize the internal combustion engine, and you can couple a electric motor with a battery pack in order to essentially not operate the internal combustion engine at its most inefficient points. So the marriage of these two unlocks a whole myriad of hybridization levels, from full hybrids that you see today, the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which will have a small battery pack that can get you some range around town, to the gentlest of hybrids that we see today, which are basically the start-stop devices. So there's a full myriad in there. In the 2010s, we really start improving the thermal efficiency of engines. There is pressure from the political administration that's in power during those times. And essentially the target was to go from, by 2025, to essentially double the fuel economy of vehicles. To go from in the year 2040 to have doubled the fuel economy from where we were in the 2010s. and essentially have an average fuel economy of 52.5 miles per gallon. And in fact, we were, of all vehicles sold in the US, and in fact, we were on track. We had a steep trajectory starting from the 70s on improving fuel efficiency. Actually, what happened was we cleaned up the internal combustion engine from the 70s to about 90. So we actually had a small penalty in thermal efficiency. And after that, and then there was a whole war in terms of getting the most powerful vehicles out there. And then fuel economy really started to take off from the 90s forward. So the last 30 years, we've been doing a great job at improving the fuel economy of vehicles and thus reducing the carbon dioxide that they emit outwards. And then in 2017, a very salacious article comes out by The Economist that is titled "The Death of the Internal Combustion Engine." Okay, so how did we get here? How did we go from the 1860s when the first engine came here, and even in 75 when we had our wake-up call that smog existed, and trying to push to have better and better fuel economy? How did we get to the point that The Economist is writing an article of the death of the internal combustion engine? I mean, how bad of a job did we do as internal combustion engineers at the end of the day, right? That's how I view this problem. And there's a few contributing factors. So you might have heard of Dieselgate that happened in 2015. So Volkswagen, which is sells quite near the most vehicles in the world as a company, they skirted emissions regulations actively to sell a vehicle, a diesel vehicle that got better fuel economy than all the rest, was cheaper, and didn't require maintenance. So you walked into a dealer and your choice was either, let's say an Audi A4 or a BMW 3 Series, the two competing sedans in that category, both of European descent. And the BMW variant was more expensive. It was a few more $1,000s because they had to cover the cost of essentially diesel emission fluid, which is urea. And so one of the after treatment devices needs this. It also required you, just like windshield washer fluid, to fill this diesel emission fluid every so many thousands of miles, right? Quite an inconvenience for a driver. And on top of all that, you got worse fuel economy than the Audi variant. And the BMW was even lighter, just the boot for the whole thing. So, and of course, slower. So they really did know what they had done wrong for quite a few years. And it turns out, well, VW had some corrupt engineers in there, right? So this is an ethics problem. And they skirted the emissions regulations. At the same time, roughly, we also are very aware of the Paris Climate Agreement. So we start to see that the average global temperature starts to increase beyond this 2-degree threshold that we feel comfortable. And a series of governments of countries essentially agree to the to this Paris Climate Agreement, of which, if we rank them by CO2, China producers in the world, China was the largest, USA was the second largest, and India was the third largest. And, that's a pretty big feat if you get the top 3 polluters to start essentially, or producers of carbon dioxide, to agree to something, right? And to decrease these carbon dioxide emissions. So the climate agreement says that we're going to decrease our temperature rise to less than 2 degrees centigrade per century, and we're going to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. Not zero emissions, net zero. So this is very important. So mid-century by 2050. We'll come back up to this. So in the face of that, of what's going on in 2015, in the face of the Dieselgate, which, we were primed to know that diesel vehicles were, that make up the majority of the medium duty and heavy duty powertrains for vehicles, not so much light duty in the US, the passenger vehicles we drive. But that was almost our hope because we were seeing higher thermal efficiencies. And then the scandal comes that essentially kills off the diesel engine. Okay, so why are internal combustion engines so bad? Internal combustion engines, I'm going to take you back to your high school.
All right, we're good.
Yeah, I get so much easier now.
Yeah.
Down, you do it.
Can you hear me?
It also just like, so you keep getting.
Jasmine, I swear to God.
Hey, can we mute that, Hiram? Mute Jacob Wentz. Thank you. Sorry about that, guys.
No worries. All right. So why are engines so bad, quote unquote? Let's go back to our high school chemistry, right? And if you have done stoichiometry, which everyone has balanced one of these reactions, usually we have a fuel plus an air, right? And we have a reaction that proceeds in one direction. We make products of combustion. And if you have the appropriate amount of air made up of, this is simulated air of oxygen and nitrogen and the proper proportions, you see that the fuel, a hydrocarbon fuel, exothermically reacts, right, with air and creates CO2 as a product, water, and nitrogen. The nitrogen is not so bad, okay, because there's a whole lot of nitrogen in the air. The water, again, that's also not very bad, but the CO2 is really what's causing the problem that the climate agreement is, the Paris Climate Agreement is trying to address. So if you look at this, even in high school, you knew that if you burn a fuel that has hydrocarbons in it, okay, then you're going to generate CO2. There's no way around that. So the problem really is the fuel that we burn, okay? And these fuels, these long hydrocarbon chains, they store a lot of energy within their bonds. And that's why we use them. The energy density of liquid gasoline or liquid diesel is unbelievably high, right? If you imagine, right, we refuel at what, 15, 20 gallons in our tanks, and that propels us 300 to 500 miles, okay? That's, unbelievable the amount of energy that you store. But most of this oil, right, most of this gasoline and diesel oil come from the ground. It comes from the time of the dinosaurs, right? That's why it's essentially called dinosaur blood, right? It's dinosaur oil that we use. And these fossil oils are really what are the cause, because when we pull it out of the ground, when we pull a liquid hydrocarbon out of the ground and we burn it in the air, we start releasing CO2 in the air. So if it remains undisturbed in the core of the earth, there is no problem to have a liquid hydrocarbon fuel. But it's really our behavior of burning it in the engine that is the problem and generates carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So if you were to ask me, right, we basically have to, well, first let's ask everybody, right? What do? You try to eliminate the fuel, okay? And you try to go to a non-carbon based fuel, because if you don't have carbon in your fuel, then you do not generate CO2. Pretty easy, the solution, okay? But what have we been told that the solution is? The solution is an EV, an electric vehicle. And why is it an electric vehicle? Because it doesn't use carbon. It doesn't use hydrocarbons. It doesn't use fossil fuels, right? It uses electricity to power itself. And you store that electricity in a battery, and then you can propel the vehicle. Okay, there's the simple issues of range anxiety, right? We've all dealt with that with our phones. And eventually phones got good enough that you could charge them for a day, and that's it, right? If I can make it a whole day with my smartphone, that's all that I really need. If you give me a day and a half of battery life, I'll be honest with you, I don't really care for it, because I still have to plug it in the middle of the next day, right? So my charging schedule has basically become every day. So what you have to start thinking about is, even when we played with our remote control cars and they were electric powered, you basically either bought a second battery or you went and you did something else at the same time. So for me, the solution of the electric vehicle and, is range anxiety the issue? No, it's not. The issue with the electric vehicle today, as we know it, is where this electricity comes from, okay? And if that electricity can be 100% renewably generated, then yes, absolutely, the answer is the electric vehicle, okay? The question then becomes, can we put electric vehicles everywhere, right? And that becomes a much harder, much taller order. In fact, most of the light duty vehicles, most of the passenger vehicles, I think we already have the battery technology that we need, okay? Just like the cell phone, I need to get to work and come back home and maybe run a couple errands when I forgot the grocery shop on Sunday and I have to do it on Tuesday because I've really run out of food. But other than that, you don't need a replacement electric vehicle that's 300, 400, and 500-mile range, right? You need maybe 90 or 100 miles. And we've had that technology. We've had that since the Chevy Volt. We've had that since the Nissan Leaf, but we haven't quite seen the electric vehicle take off. So I think the tide is changing here, right? But let's walk a little bit forward to understand why the electric vehicle has had a little bit of a hard time penetrating through the traditional vehicle market today. So the internal combustion engine, today in the real world, what are the numbers? The numbers are staggering, okay? The problem is very, very big. There are 1.3 billion vehicles worldwide, okay? We are 280 million of those in the United States. There's another about 280 some million in Europe, and China has about the same. So we're looking at about a third and a third and a third just across 3 countries. We have a lot of vehicles here, especially given our population. The US market share of vehicles, 92% are gasoline, 3% are diesels, less than 3% are hybrids, and less than 1% are electric vehicles. These are 2020 numbers. They didn't really change much from last year because of the pandemic. And if we look at the European market, the composition's a little different. They have about 52% gasoline. They were a little bit further ahead in the spectrum by doing diesel adoption. There's 2 reasons for that. Diesel not only, so the compression ignition engine compared to the spark ignition engine, gasoline is used in the spark ignition engine, diesel is used in the compression ignition engine. The compression ignition engine is about 25% more efficient than the spark ignition engine, just by its thermodynamic nature. And in Europe, diesel fuel is kept cheaper, about 25% cheaper than gasoline, because they would prefer for you to operate a more efficient vehicle, since you're going to generate less CO2. So really, there's about almost a 50% benefit to a diesel vehicle in Europe. A little bit more conscious there, so 9.4 hybrids percentage-wise, and also electric vehicles. So countries like Estonia, also Norway, essentially, they make it so cheap to own an electric vehicle that it's basically the only choice. A lot of the Nordic countries have essentially made a lot of their money in fossil oil, and they know that at some point their reserves are going to run out, and so will their industry. So they've, instead of consuming that money, they've actually put it to good use, and they've worked really, really hard to build offshore wind farms and place electric vehicle chargers everywhere and subsidize new vehicle sales to essentially favor electric vehicles. But they're doing it right because they're building their renewable energy first, and they're putting a lot of money to do that. And then they're essentially converting to electric vehicles. If you look at where we've been in the US, 2011 to 2016, I mean, gasoline powertrain is essentially really dominating us. Diesel fuel is more expensive here because it's primarily used for commercial transport and for heavy duty vehicles, so the big trucks you see on the highway. Essentially, diesel oil, diesel fuel. The reason why it's more expensive is because it's a tax to it's basically taxed to take care of the wear and tear that the trucks put on the roads themselves. So if any of you run heating oil in your homes, it's very similar to the number 2 diesel oil that you buy at the gas station. In fact, it's the same. The only difference is you dye the heating oil red because it's untaxed if you use it for non-transportation purposes. So for agricultural purposes and heating purposes, it's basically untaxed, and they color it. If you try running it in your car, I mean, your car will definitely operate on it. If someone suspects that you're doing it, so in places like a little bit more rural places, they will actually, a state trooper can take basically a long paint stick and put it inside your car, or state troopers also inspect semi trucks for this. So because the gas tanks are right there, they unscrew them, they put in a stick, and if it comes out that reddish pink color, then they know it's untaxed diesel, and they get fined quite heavily. Plug-in hybrids and hybrids. Keep in mind, the first Toyota Prius came on the market in the year 2000. It really revolutionized the internal combustion engine in vehicles and really achieved a fuel economy numbers that were never before seen. Essentially, electric vehicles are almost nowhere to be found. And even if we look at the subset in California of essentially electric vehicles and hybrids, we still see less than 10% in one of the most progressive states in the US. So let's talk about miles per gallon a little bit, because this really matters. If you look at the vehicle sticker, so a vehicle sticker that you buy today on the lot looks something like this. If it just has an internal combustion engine, just has the right block. If it's a hybrid, it would have both blocks. And if it's just an electric vehicle, it's only going to have the left block. Okay. And if you look at this map on the left, there was a very nice study done by the EPA that essentially looked at if you had an electric vehicle in every single state, what would the mile per gallon equivalent internal combustion engine powered vehicle have to be in order to compete on a carbon basis with the electric vehicle? Why? Well, if it was all renewable, then these numbers would essentially be infinity miles per gallon, but they're not, right? We have coal-fired power plants. If we're unlucky, if we're lucky, we have nice, clean, natural gas-fired power plants. And apparently nuclear is not very popular anymore, but if we had that, once again, these numbers would have to be near infinity. So if you look at a state like state of Michigan that I came from, if you drive a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf or a Chevy Volt, I don't want to beat up on any one specific manufacturer, you're actually achieving 38 miles per gallon going down the road. So when I see those license plates and they say 0 emissions, the first thing I think about, I'm like, this is a thermodynamic control volume problem. So, you know, yeah, of course, there's 0 tailpipe emissions. That vehicle is not making any emissions right there, right? As a local, pollution is improving, absolutely. But that power plant is in someone's backyard. So out of sight, out of mind when it comes to driving an electric vehicle in Michigan. So I actually joke that electric vehicles are elsewhere emission vehicles, because that's really what they are. Now, look, places like the Northwest Pacific that have high levels of hydropower, or places like upstate New York, once again, that have hydropower, then you need an internal combustion engine that's capable of achieving 135 miles per gallon, right? Else it's much cleaner to drive a Tesla, right? Well, In 2017, the Toyota Prius Prime, and I have no ownership in Toyota or anything, but in 2017, they released a vehicle that is hybridized, is economical, is achievable, right? It's already out there and you can just buy it, and there's no fancy tech. It's all very well proven, and it gets 133 miles per gallon equivalent when you plug it in to have the small battery pack charged. And it still has internal combustion engine, so your ranges don't have range anxiety. And guess what? Only in upstate New York would buying a Tesla actually be better off than the Toyota Prius Prime. But if you were in Michigan, or if you were on our Long Island state here, or our state, our region of Long Island, right? Driving a Tesla is actually almost 3 times worse than driving the Prius Prime. Yeah, but no one wants to be seen in a Prius Prime, apparently. That's the real issue. Okay, everyone would prefer a nice 5 Series BMW or a nice Model S. But really, if you care about the carbon footprint of a vehicle, you have to look at this map and you have to understand where the electricity is generated and what the equivalent mile per gallon number is. And it's not just the carbon footprint while you use the vehicle, okay? That's just a very narrow one use, right? You have to actually look at it over the whole life cycle. And it turns out that the Financial Times posted a nice article in 2017, actually kind of combating the Economist article. And it said, look, the electric car's green image blackens beneath the bonnet. And the reality is, it kind of varies, okay? But here's what they set up. They basically said, look, here's your Tesla Model S, your P100D, and we're basically going to look at the equivalent kilograms of CO2 that are emitted throughout the different phases of its life cycle. And we're going to compare it against an equivalent luxury vehicle, a BMW 7 Series with an internal combustion engine. And we're going to compare it up against a Mitsubishi Mirage that I think no one ever aspires to purchase, right? But I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, right? But if someone were to give you a BMW 7 Series or a Tesla Model S, or Model S, you'd rather take that. Well, if you look at the production emissions, you look at the use emissions, clearly the Model S has about half the amount of CO2 emitted. It's not zero, right? Because we have natural gas-fired power plants today. But you see that the BMW produces more during its use phase, a little less in the production phase because the battery pack is very intensive on a CO2 basis to produce. End of life is about the same for these vehicles because they're heavier, a little lighter vehicles, a little less. But the Mitsubishi Mirage is really the winner here because not only does it, because it's lighter and it's less fancy, it generates less about the same CO2 as the Model S, and it's actually quite cheap to produce. So the total life cycle emissions, if you divide over the lifespan of the vehicle, 270,000 kilometers, the winner is the Mitsubishi Mirage with an internal combustion engine. It just, nobody really wants to buy that. But if you care about the CO2, once again, you would be trying to buy a vehicle based on the numbers, not based on the marketing. So how can we fix this? Okay, how can we fix this problem a little bit on essentially with electric vehicles and essentially the fact that the use phase is not near zero, right? And it's contributing. Because if we can get this number down to zero, then it really does become the clear winner. And we can do that by sensible legislation. Right here in our home state, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act essentially set these targets in 2019. We're going to have 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So these are 85%. We're going to have 100% zero emission electricity by 2040. So they're starting to ramp up the production of offshore wind like crazy. We're talking about 70% renewable energy by the end of this decade. That's what we need to make electric vehicles penetrate and be essentially clean and not elsewhere emission vehicles. How are we going to do that? 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, 3,000 megawatts of energy storage, and 6,000 megawatts of solar by 2035, 2035, 30, and 25 respectively. How are we doing this? Essentially, the Clean Action Council was formed to prepare a scoping plan, and the Transportation Advisory Panel is one of the many panels that advises the Clean Action Council, and we're developing recommendations on both ground, air, and maritime transportation on how we can achieve these 85% greenhouse gas emissions, 85% reduction. And believe it or not, right? So they appointed me on there because they know that the solution is not all electric, right? And there is going to be this interim where we're not quite there yet. Okay, so we're talking about lower carbon fuels. We're talking about alternative fuels. We're talking about synthetic hydrocarbon fuels. So imagine the hydrocarbon itself is not what's bad. It's the fact that we're taking it out of the ground and releasing it in the air. So if you could capture CO2 that's already in the air, and you could use solar or offshore wind or onshore wind to basically produce renewable electricity and use an electrolyzer to split water and generate hydrogen, I could now combine the captured CO2 out of the atmosphere and combine it with the green hydrogen I've made in order to get a synthetic liquid hydrocarbon fuel, something known as an e-fuel, that then we could perhaps burn in the internal combustion engine, and that would be net zero CO2. Another thing that we could do inside the internal combustion engine is we could, for example, use biofuels where they absorb essentially the CO2 as they are growing through photosynthesis. And then when we burn it, we're essentially, that's considered net zero because the plant has already taken that CO2 out of the atmosphere. So there is a little bit of a life cycle issue there, but there are avenues. Okay, but let's work on fixing the electric grid. Let's work on getting these 85% reductions in net zero, getting our 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, but do we still need internal combustion engines? And I like to look at very reasonable data. Okay, so on the New York Clean Action Council, we basically just ran through all the numbers, and we weren't going to make this 85% reduction. And by 2030, the state wants to go to 50% of new vehicle sales need to be all electric. That number has now been improved from 50% to 100% all electric. And let's see what that does to the number of internal combustion vehicles out there. So there's 4 figures here. The top one is the global annual passenger vehicle sales by drivetrain. Okay. These are reasonable numbers by Bloomberg. Okay. New York State, we're picking numbers to try to meet targets. 50% didn't work. Now we're at 100% of new vehicle light duty sales by what it is, 2030. I think maybe, yeah, I think they're saying 2030 now. These numbers are in flux. That doesn't really matter. But let's look at real numbers aggregated by not where we want to be, right? But what's probably achievable from the industry. And a number like 40% of new vehicle sales, if that was all battery electric, that would be excellent if we can achieve that. That would far exceed, recall that there's only about 10% of vehicles that are hybrids today. So if all electric vehicles could enjoy the success that Toyota Prius has had, which has actually been phenomenal in terms of vehicle sales, then we're talking about over 20 years to get 10% market share. And we're saying it's got to have to be 4 times that, okay, from the year 2020. And if we do that, then our internal combustion engine powered vehicles will go from 100% that they are today, just under. They'll plummet down to 40%. And our electric vehicles are going to go up to 60%. Excellent. Look, it takes about the turnover in the US, right? 290 million vehicle 290 million vehicles in here. There's 15 million vehicles every year that are sold and about 15 million retired. So if you do the math, it takes almost 20 years to recycle the entire fleet. So whatever technology is going in today in 2020, that's the technology that's going to be coming out in 2040. Think about that for a second. So if we are not selling all electric vehicles today, there's no way we're going to get to 100% electric vehicles in 2040. I mean, there isn't, right? So you look at the numbers, and if we can do 40%, then we'll essentially come up to 60%. Great. But that's only half the equation. That's just the number of vehicles sold. Now let's look at it from the entire fleet, right? And if you look at the fleet, okay, while we might be selling 60% of vehicles, the entire fleet of the 1.8 billion vehicles that we said, that's maybe looking much closer. I'm sorry, the 1.2 billion vehicles that we said, the internal combustion engine is dropping off a little bit, but really it's kind of what we're seeing is battery electric and hybrids are just going to make up the expansion, which is something that we've already seen the case with renewable energy. Renewable energy has, quote unquote, failed to displace our fossil fuel electricity production in a broad way. It's done as best as it can, but it's really just essentially augmenting, it's replacing our increase, but it's just barely eating away at the entire pie, right? So we have to accelerate. And if you look at it, figure 8 here. So this is the global share of annual passenger vehicle distance traveled by drivetrain. It gets even worse. We're selling essentially electric vehicles to those that don't use them. Okay, so by 2040, about 35% of the total distance traveled by vehicles will be on these electric vehicles. And the internal combustion engines, even though, you know, we're selling less than 40%, right? We're talking about them generating over 60% of the vehicle miles traveled. So yes, I understand. We don't like internal combustion engines. We don't like fossil fuels, right? But the numbers dictate that even if we do these aggressive changes of trying to change the powertrain, which we don't even know what will happen to battery storage or the capacity of the battery after 10 years of vehicles. So your phone, right? Who has a 10-year-old phone? I don't think probably a lot of us have 10-year-old phones, right? In fact, after a year, you probably start noticing your phone's performance degrading. But it's okay, right? It's an expensive purchase. You try to make it go as long as possible. 2 years, some of us start thinking about changing our phones. 3, 4 years. I mean, your phone's still usable, right? I'm still using my phone after 3+ years. Well, the thing is, you know, though, that the performance degrades, right? If I go and I look at my battery, it doesn't last nearly as long. I mean, I don't have the latest tech, that's fine, okay. But phone manufacturers and battery manufacturers have played a very interesting trick on us, okay. And you can't get mad at them. It is what it is. So there's something called the relative state of charge. It's that percentage that you see at the very top of your phone, 100% or 0%. And then there's the absolute state of charge of the battery. When we talk about that relative state of charge, that is essentially just some small subset of the full range of the battery. But guess what? The battery can't operate in the bottom 20, 30%. I'm not an expert in the battery, so exactly where the limits are. And it can't operate near the top. I think it's got to stay below like 90%. But if I robbed 10% of that battery from the get-go, I gave you a little bit larger battery and I told you 0 to 100% and you can get 6 hours of use at all times. And I know your battery is going to degrade, and it's going to degrade 1% every month. Okay. But what can I do? I can essentially effectively decrease your relative state of charge, and you'll never know it, right? I got 6 hours of use on day 1. All I care is that I'm still getting 6 hours of use after a year. But I just told you the batteries can degrade 1% per month. So if you are the Apples and the Samsungs of the world and the Teslas of the world, what do? you rob about 10% of that reserve capacity, or 15%. And for every 2 months, okay, so for every month, instead of losing 1% due to battery degradation that you have no control over, what you do is you unlock 0.5% of your reserve capacity. So that way your effective battery degradation appears to be reasonable, and it appears to be 1% every 2 months. And you're like, wow, Apple and Samsung are doing a way better job than XYZ brand who isn't employing this technology. Well, Tesla's doing the same thing, and so are every other companies that use battery things, including your laptop, right? Everyone has figured out this trick. So all this is well and good up until you get your reserve capacity to be fully depleted. And at that point in time, then you experience the full degradation of the battery. That's where I'm at on my phone today, where I see I can tell even in 3 months that my battery has degraded much more than the 3 months before that, because I am well out of that reserve capacity range, and it is what it is. The vehicles, they do the same exact thing. They expect the vehicle to last 100,000 miles, 120,000 miles, and that's where they basically reserve that much capacity to unlock the equivalent to try to maintain very reasonable degradations. But after you get out of there, right? My vehicle has, I don't know, 115, 120,000 miles, right? And probably has legs for a few more years, hopefully, knock on wood. But, you know, people still drive these, right? It's nice to talk about new vehicle sales, and it's nice to talk about what we can do for changing starting today. But the reality of the matter is you have a legacy fleet out there, and you will continue to have a legacy fleet all the way from this year to hopefully when I retire in 2040 or maybe 2050. And if you can see, the total share of internal combustion engines is going to be very high. And even if we sell at an aggressive rate fully electric vehicles, which I certainly hope we do. I certainly hope that we put renewable energy everywhere. You have to understand, I'm one of the biggest proponents for these technologies. But do not be naive and say that internal combustion engines are dead, right? And do not be naive and say that we do not need internal combustion engines. And we're done doing this research because, well, the reality of the matter is, look at the vehicle miles traveled in 2040. Over 60% of those will be in some form of internal combustion engine. I fully hope it is not a pure internal combustion engine by then, right? I hope it's in a very hybridized state. But nonetheless, we need to keep improving on internal combustion engine research. Whether we like to or not, this is what we have in place. And we need to figure out how to transition off of fossil fuels. That's really the answer to this. It's the fossil fuel that's causing the internal combustion engine to be terrible. Okay, that's the reality of the matter. So if we can find a different fuel in there, right? That's the name of the game here. So if we can find a different fuel, then the internal combustion engine can not only live, okay, we don't really have an option. We have to make it live, and we have to keep improving it in order to essentially do something about every other vehicle that's on the road there. If I start displacing the gasoline that's in that fuel pump, right, then you might have some adverse effects, but if I can put a biofuel in there and you can still use your vehicle, there's not going to be any upset over whether we're decreasing our carbon footprint of transportation, right? It's only when I start infringing, quote unquote, on your rights or your abilities to do things, right, or telling you what you have to and don't have to buy, that then it becomes a contentious argument. But there's just a lot of work that needs to be done for internal combustion engines, because we have to keep making them more efficient if we know that they're going to be around. So 2017, we get out of this valley of death, quote unquote, and we get to 2019. And well, we're seeing now articles, 2019, 2020, 2021, that, well, it's not dead yet. It's still ticking along. Numbers are still kind of in the favor of internal combustion engines having to exist. And this is, if you kind of even look at the federal funding scene, okay, in the years 2017, 2018, well, let's say 2016, 17, 18, right? Because there's a little memory effect. The government basically said the priorities were electric vehicles. Like all the funding basically went out there. It was for the first time in my life that I saw the annual research expenditures of the Department of Energy go from being, I don't know, near 120 million, which at some point was all for internal combustion engines. Fine, non-issue, okay. That number is now roughly about half that. But there was a year in there in 2018, 2019, right? That because that money was appropriated a year before that, that we went down to about $10 million of federal research money for internal combustion engines for Department of Energy. I mean, that's astounding, right? And they very quickly realized that, yes, we understand it's not beautiful. It's not the greatest thing that we have, but it's abundant. It's everywhere. It's equitable. Okay. It's economic. So we have to figure out how to make it better. And like I said, it's not about the device itself. The device itself is not what produces the device itself is a thermodynamic conversion device, right? It's essentially an air pump. It's just a piston that's going up and down. It's what we feed it in that's the problem. So if we can feed a hydrocarbon or a carbon-free fuel, okay, or even a carbon-negative fuel, that exists as well, then we can actually be using engines to clean up the CO2 in the world. You think this is like crazy speak, but when the first SULEV, super ultra low emission vehicles came out in California, they were actually releasing air out of the tailpipe that had lower emission count, lower pollutants than what was getting breathed in at the air filter. So it was funny because, you know, it was Honda that had the first engine that was a SULEV, and they were basically calling them the Hoovers of the world because they were taking the LA smog and they were essentially cleaning it up over the catalyst, right? And there's no reason why we can't have engines do that again, okay? But we got to stop feeding them fossil fuels. Whoever is a proponent of fossil fuels, I think you've probably missed the boat here. Like, it's time to move on from them. Like, it is really causing an issue. But the internal combustion engine itself is a very versatile, very flexible device. So if you look at all the facts, I really think the answer is not yet. And someone's got to do this tough work, okay? And I can't do it alone. So I'm hoping to inspire you. And I also have a wonderful team of graduate students. So 3 experimentalists, 3 computationalists, including a master's thesis student that's a Fulbright scholar, and even an undergrad that's doing a research project with me, an undergraduate research study. And they're really the ones that are on the forefront, pushing the boundaries to help us make a better story of why internal combustion engines have a future and how we can keep improving them. So they're really the real heroes here that have stepped forward. They understand that this is a tall challenge and it's not one that anyone wants to really fight, but we're qualified and we're ambitious to make that change. We have a laboratory at the Advanced Energy Research Center, and we also have space at the Institute for Advanced Computational Science. We're lucky to have both of these very modern facilities. Both of these are less than 10 years old. I mean, it's beautiful to work in each one of these. And a few of kind of the ways that we go after addressing and trying to essentially improve the thermal efficiency of engines is we look at different combustion modes, right? So we don't just look at spark ignition or compression ignition. We look at something called dual fuel ignition. We look at low temperature combustion. We look at homogeneous charge compression ignition. I mean, it's just endless. We look at turbulent jet ignition that I've done in the past. We use computational fluid dynamics to greatly assist our knowledge. I mean, we're making surrogate biofuels that we can blend in with diesel in order to essentially decrease the amount of fossil diesel that we need to burn in consumers. And if we can get this fuel certified with our partners at RTI this summer, I mean, this will be a big breakthrough for our community. And we're not the only ones. There's other ones that are other researchers and research groups that are working on these fields. And, you know, we even employ our skills, right? We're mechanical engineers at the end of the day. We deal with flows, with heat transfer, with combustion, with thermodynamics. And there's nothing preventing us from taking our computational knowledge, for example, and even applying it to evaluate wind turbines. So, and, you know, pet peeve of mine is connected automated vehicles. I'll just show you a couple small slides of my research, for example, my group's research. So this is something that Chognan Ran, Ruinan Yang, and Rodrigo Risto-Hadlich have worked significantly on. So this concept of dual fuel combustion. And specifically, we are taking, so imagine this, what fuel are we using, right? We are using the emissions that come out of a hydrogen and natural gas fired fuel cell. Think about that. There is calorific value left in the emissions of a fuel cell. I thought the fuel cell was so clean, but if you run it on natural gas and you have a solid oxide fuel cell, which seems to be the flavor of the week these days, you can put an internal combustion engine after it. And it's really hard to burn that fuel because it doesn't have a lot of calorific value, but it's got some content in it. And we've essentially developed a way to actually burn it in the laboratory. So the students have been great. This work was funded for 2 years from one of DOE's arms, so ARPA-E under the Integrate program. And we showed, essentially, we effectively demonstrated that we can have 70+% electricity or fuel to electricity conversion using this hybrid solid oxide internal combustion engine system. I mean, this pushes the boundary of natural gas fired electricity power plants, and it certainly is much, much better than coal-fired power plants. Another project, so, you know, talking about these biofuels, so we're literally making samples. We're making naphthenic biofuel in the laboratory. We're making surrogates of it. We're working with our partners at RTI International. So they actually have the 1 ton per day reactor that's converting the biomass into liquid diesel fuel. And we're essentially, they're characterizing from the chemistry viewpoint. And we're essentially looking at the combustion and the emissions performance side in our engine here at Stony Brook. So if this process works, we can essentially make diesel fuel equivalent from biomass, right? And I mean, it's just a matter of scaling it up. So fingers crossed that we meet this. There's an ASTM specification D975 this summer. But if it's good to go, then all the emissions data and all the work we've done in order to tailor the formulation of this fuel has really paid off and can provide a solution. So this work was funded by Department of Energy Vehicle Technologies Office and the Bioenergy Technologies Office. Again, the 3 experimentalists are working on this. So Chognan Ren, Ruinan Yang, and Rodrigo Risto-Hadlich. And they're really on the forefront, mixing the fuels and running the experiments and taking the measurements in order to get us to a cleaner future. One of my other students, Gaurav Guleria, so he's working with Sandia National Laboratory on basically creating a gasoline style high efficiency combustion mode called partial fuel stratification that can provide a gasoline alternative for essentially medium duty and heavy duty diesel engines. And we're essentially trying to understand the fuel stratification computationally for our partners at Sandia National Laboratory. And you can see, you know, we look at every single parcel of fuel in here. What you see is 2 injections. So that's an early injection of fuel injection in order to kind of prime the chamber. And then there's going to be a later second injection. And we look at what the equivalence ratio distribution is within that entire volume. And we look at the temperature, and we can tell you when it starts to ignite, and we can tailor the timings and really understand, is it the rich zones that are going first, the leaner zones? Where is our thermal stratification? Where is our compositional stratification? And I mean, these data that you see here, right? So this seems as if it's easy to get, but Gaurav sits there and pecks probably for, I don't know, one of these runs to complete, just literally to complete on the cluster here at Stony Brook takes us maybe close to 2 or 3 weeks of runtime, right? The analysis is a whole separate animal, and so is the pre-processing. So one of my other graduate students, or two of the other ones, Ioannis Nikiforakis, and this work was led actually by Mahmoud Koraim. Again, both computationalists. We looked at essentially the levelized cost of electricity produced by a wind turbine if we try to improve the performance by adding a conical diffuser in it. So, I mean, you're basically trying to accelerate the velocity and straighten out the flow in order to capture more air to go over the wind turbine blades. And we look at both the wake field, we look at specifically can we increase the velocity? So if you see the far field velocity is probably around 9 meters per second, but inside the diffuser here, we've actually been able to accelerate around 11 or 12 meters per second. So we're able to essentially evaluate that. We don't just do a simple evaluation. We also do a life cycle assessment and look at different shapes, right? Is it cheaper to make essentially a very simple geometry or that you can kind of just piece together, maybe out of 2 pieces of sheet metal, or should we do one of these wing optimizations and essentially get kind of the highest flow field possible? And even us mechanical engineers get calls of action. So this was back in COVID. So in March or in April, right when COVID had basically hit, over the course of 10 days, Professor John Longton, that you know, so he led our team, and Professor John Bertelli from School of Health Technology and Management. We developed essentially a ventilator in 10 days that you see here on the left-hand side, right during the peak. And we were basically on standby in order to start essentially putting it on a human. We even did animal tests to ensure that it was safe to operate. And we were very lucky that the numbers literally started turning down and there was enough ventilators at that time, but very, very scary times. So, and then this is my personal passion project. So as connectivity and automation starts essentially moving forward into transportation and giving us another level of essentially reducing greenhouse gas emissions by essentially changing the energy demand profile. This changes where we can operate. So instead of needing to have these wide ranges of operating space for a driver like myself who's technically unpredictable, right? You can have a computer that always accelerates at kind of a fast but smooth pace. You can have essentially very different operating points. So once we know what that new duty cycle looks like, then that means that we could redesign the powertrain. And especially as we look at hybrids, a lot of future there. And then we can go back to our advanced combustion modes, our low temperature combustion, go back to our fundamentals and design kind of the cleanest combustion modes using the existing hardware that we have today. Okay, it's just a matter of how we prepare the fuel, when we inject it, how we ignite it. We have so much more control now and so many more advanced computational tools and experimental techniques and nice sensors and equipment to tell us what we're doing that, you know, I think the future is really, really bright. So thank you for your attention. I know it was a little bit of a longer session, but it seems that not too many people dropped off but thank you for your attention. I'm happy to stay and have a little Q&A too if those have if people have questions.
So thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'm a little bit biased, but I think this lecture and Dr. Porwar's lecture were the like best ones and so engaging. You obviously went like a lot over, but like honestly, the information was so like interesting, and we want to thank you so much for taking your time to like be with us for tonight. We usually do take questions, but I'm actually going to just like encourage like everybody take his class. Like if you're a mech major, like sign up like for the fall. I do want to be greedy in this because like we did have like a bunch of questions that were fielded before this, and you did answer some of them, but I'm gonna skip those like for now and just really like say like take his class because it's amazing, and that's like the same amount of passion and like energy he brings to his classes, and you will learn so much. But I'm gonna steal one question, and in the fall, we had a lecture by Dr. Taejin Kim. I think he's in the chemical engineering. Our future president, Maya, she brought him in. And I had a question just like, is there technologies for like the catalytic converter that could actually like take all that CO2 so we can reuse it for some of these other methods of like reusing that CO2 in the air? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so this isn't my direct area of research. If you can make a fuel, right, one of these e-fuels that essentially takes, there's some direct air capture technologies that take the CO2 out. But ultimately, for example, I'll show you here on this work with Ophe that we do, the biomass is thermochemically converted at temperature. Okay, over the process called the catalytic fast pyrolysis. This process relies heavily on a catalyst. So there are applications that if you can improve the chemistry in that catalyst, you can make it more efficient, you can do it at lower temperatures, that this process would need less energy. Where do we get that energy? The goal here is to essentially have it be generated renewably in the future, right? But we won't be using the electricity itself for transportation in all aspects, right? You can't have a semi truck going across the United States, right? You can't. The amount of batteries that you need will decrease the volume so significantly that you either have to add more cargo space, right? Or the cost to deliver a cubic foot or whatever of cargo will double if you cut it in half, because I mean, it's just the name of the game, right? There's no good way to do that. So in terms of fuels, I think catalysts can definitely help there. There could be some CO2 capture technologies. The other thing is, even for present internal combustion engines, getting a three-way catalyst or even oxidation catalyst. So the three-way catalyst works very well for a spark ignition engine that operates stoichiometrically. But if you look at any of these other combustion modes that we're looking at, we are essentially pushing the boundary on how we can convert thermally the fuel that we put in, and we can extract more work out of a given amount of energy content that we put in. Okay. Some of these drawbacks, though, for example, they might have less emissions, or they might have some emissions that we still have to take care of. But like one of the biggest issues with low temperature combustion is that it is low temperature. We're extracting everything out of the chamber, so there's almost nothing left for the catalyst to remain to temperature. And if you recall, catalysts need to have a minimum temperature in order for those reactions to proceed forward. So the work on low temperature catalysts, for example, is hand in hand with low temperature combustion. Otherwise, there's no point to do the low temperature combustion work. So even if we can get 10% better thermal efficiency, if we can't take care of even the smallest amount of pollutants that go out of that engine, then we'll never put it on the road. So there's a lot of work, and that's all materials there, materials and chemistry.
Amen. And it seems like that what we're going through, it almost from hearing your like lecture, which was so interesting, like it seems like electric might be the transition that we need to actually bring the internal combustion engine to a higher standard.
If you ask me, we should hybridize everything. Okay, we should not have pure ICs, and they definitely should not be running on fossil fuel. That's like a given. Okay, and if that was, you have to understand, whenever we push the boundaries on fuel efficiency, whenever we push the boundaries on, we get tighter and tighter emissions regulations. These are all good things because they basically cause work for me and my group. So I like the challenge, right? That's why I do this. But you have to understand, we cannot remain stagnant on gasoline at 80, 90%. Like, mark my words, we cannot do that, okay? And do you see all these options? All of them need to be executed, and all of them need to be advanced as fast as we possibly can. What we should not be doing is picking winners and losers. We should not be saying electric only and forget the fuel cell, okay? We should not say, let's do all fuel cell and forget diesels that can run on biofuel, right? It just, you gotta put this puzzle together, because we all need to run together in the same direction, because I'm worried that we basically will not get to the finish line in time. So there is no like, am I taking lane 1, lane 2, or lane 3? Okay, this is no. Let's all sprint forward. Let's all be friends, okay? And make sure that we try to have a cleaner future for our kids tomorrow.
Amen. So you don't think that focusing on electric, because that technology is already right here, ready to like rock and roll for like a short period of time, isn't like, because like it almost seems like if we do push electric forward really, really quick, it will drop the like CO2 emissions by a lot until we kind of get the like hybrids and like some of these alternative fuels, and even building synthetic fuels that can not even have carbons, like so we can move away from the hydrocarbons.
So look, I think it's something like this, okay? We got to look at this map. Wherever that map has very high numbers, wherever we can put, you want electric vehicles, the first stop is you got to invest in renewable energy. Go put up solar panels and everything. Don't give credits to get electric vehicles out on the road. Give credits to clean up the grid. The minute you have a clean grid, you can sell an electric vehicle and you'll have clean CO2. Otherwise, we go back to this conundrum of, we're in Michigan, you have a fancy Tesla next to you that has 0 emissions plate, okay? But its equivalent mile per gallon, because it's from a coal-fired power plant getting fueled, is 38 miles per gallon. So I ask you, not today's technology of 2022 model year vehicles that are out there. I'm telling you that 5-year-old vehicle is able to ascertain 54 miles per gallon on gasoline and 133 in hybridized state of existing technology. Why would we not promote that vehicle if what we're asking is to clean? So promote this Prius Prime, okay, and equivalent classes, and then pour as much money as you can to get renewable energy on there and upgrade your grid. And then, yes, of course, downtown transient driving downtown New York City, I better not see any internal combustion engines there. That would be like a sin. But if you're telling me, you're going to be driving 300 plus miles, or maybe towing a boat, right? Or construction equipment, right? Or I don't know, you want your grandma, if she ever needs a medical emergency, you want her to be on an electric ambulance? I don't know about that. I don't want to make sure there's no range anxiety, right? And they need 24/7 uptime. So there are unique challenges here. So electrification is not the right answer for everything, right? But maybe that's where hydrogen fuel cells make sense once we build out the hydrogen infrastructure, right? So we can't blindly say that there is one solution only, right? It's got to be, there's no one silver bullet. It's a multi-pronged approach, both dependent on geographical location and use case. right?
Wow.
What the right technology is. And yeah, I mean, probably engines are going to be, my work is shifting very rapidly away from light duty, and that's okay, right? I still, I enjoy vehicles like that we drive and to see the technology in them. But what do you think we're doing with shipping vessels? I mean, you're not going to put batteries on a tanker ship that's going across the ocean. Like that, that's like, I mean, I don't know. I've heard of electric airplanes, right? But again, are you going to take all the tubes that are in the sky and make them all electric by 2040? I don't think so. I don't think so. So you better be working on some kind of renewable jet fuel starting today, I hope 10 years ago, in order to get it in there as soon as possible.
Amen.
So look at this map, right? Upstate New York, I give you a pass if you drive a Tesla. If I see you in Michigan, I don't give you a pass. And on Long Island, you get kind of a half pass.
Thank you, man. That makes a lot of sense.
Are there any questions in the chat or?
I kind of like told everybody that we're probably good because like we're running so late, and I feel
Sorry to make it late, but I hope you at least enjoyed it. I figured people could drop off if they got bored.
Man, well, I think unless somebody has like a really, really burning question that they wanted to shout out right now, you can unmute yourself. But if nobody does in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thanks for such a good audience.